Jeff Mann. This is my contact information if you care to contact me anytime. Happy to hear from you, happy to answer questions, happy to discuss things. I consider myself to be a teacher of some sorts. I am in the consulting world again after a brief hiatus in the vendor land. This is my compulsory company slide because they are paying my way to be here. Pretty cool company, nobody's ever heard of it, and we have a very large and growing consulting practice. We do the security and compliance type stuff. We have a pen testing group, so on and so forth. So that's enough about that. I do want to apologize ahead of time because the things that I describe in this talk that are problems, I've been caught up in a lot of it over the years. As we talk about it, just keep that in the back of the mind. A friend of mine named Paul Asadorian, everybody know who Paul Asadorian is? He's given a couple talks. One is called Everything That He Learned About Security He Learned from Kung Fu Movies. And another one he gives is Everything I Learned About Security. Gosh, what was the second one he did? Kung Fu and Hip Hop, I think it's the second one. So I thought I'd give a talk someday. I haven't put it together yet, but this is the one that I'm going to give someday. So a little bit about me, just to give a little bit of context of why I'm up here pontificating and talking about what I think is wrong with the security world, or asking us, essentially, what are we doing here? 37 some odd years in the business, officially 35. I got my first start in 1984, and I'll tell a little bit about that. Most of my time, in terms of my formative years, was spent at NSA. I started there actually in 1986, and this was a popular T-shirt back then, and I think NSA might still be behind schedule. While I was at NSA, very briefly, I worked on what was then called the InfoSec side of the house, the defensive side of the house, and I was in what was called the manual crypto systems shop. We dealt with paper, one-time pads, paper cipher systems, things that we usually do in puzzles these days. Go up to Cypher Village, you can probably find some upstairs. But one of the first things I did when I was there, 86, 87, was there was this newfangled thing called a desktop PC, and we had customers that said, is there any way you could write a computer program to do this encryption and decryption on the one-time pad? Because it takes hours sometimes to do it. And we're like, yeah, we can do that. So I was actually responsible for, as near as I can tell, the first quote-unquote software-based crypto system that NSA ever produced. In the process of working with one-time pads, I came up with this little cryptologic aid, this little cipher wheel here that does the algorithm for a particular type of one-time pad. This was used by the U.S. Special Forces for quite a few years. They called it the Whizzy wheel. I called it the Visionaire wheel. I got a cash award when I came up with this. My boss wrote it up, and it was entitled "Man Reinvents Wheel." I spent a little bit of time on the operations side of the house. What most people know about NSA, what they think of when they think of NSA is the operations side, the offensive side. NSA is the ears of the country, listening to all of our adversaries. And I happened to be there during the time of the first Gulf engagement, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which lasted, Desert Shield was a series, I guess a couple of weeks or months, and Desert Storm was over in hours. And then the last part of my NSA career, and I actually do another talk that goes more into detail of this, but I ended up being in an office back on the InfoSec side at the beginnings of sort of the popularity of the internet and everybody jumping on the internet. And I ended up working for a group that started to learn how to do pen testing, and we did that for NSA. This book came out a couple years ago called Dark Territory. In that book, chapter 4 is entitled Eligible Receivers. Anybody read this book? A couple people. Recommended reading. In this book, in this chapter, there's a paragraph here, and I will read it dramatically to you, if I may, if you'll indulge me for a moment. Starting kind of in the middle. During its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. Isn't that cool? I actually was part of the pit. I was one of the founding members of the pit. The pit existed in a building. This is an aerial shot of some buildings just west of BWI Airport in Baltimore. The pit was in this building in this corner. And the pit was actually just a group of hackers, group of guys working. There were 6 of us. Oh, and the audio is there. We used to play this when we were hacking. We'll turn that off, Bill. There were 6 of us. 2 of us still work at NSA. 4 of us are out in the private sector, out in the real world. The only other one that I have the permission to let you know who it is Ron Gula. You may have heard of him. He founded this company called Tenable, and which just went public, and some of my good friends are still working there and might be in the audience, and I wonder why they haven't retired yet. But that's another story. And I have to say this, and is it too early to drink? Because when I say PCI, usually somebody puts a drink in my hand. Spam? Too early? Okay. But before you dismiss me because of PCI, this is a list of the customers that I had. I was a QSA for 10 years, and I am allowed to say that I was the QSA for the TJX companies. They were breached back in 2008. I started with them after that, but I was their QSA for 6 years, up until the time when I stopped doing it. Heartland Payment Systems, it's a matter of public record. They were also breached back in 2008-ish, 2009-ish. I was part of the team that we sort of smoke jumped in and helped them get back into compliance, as it were, back in the day. So I had quite a bit of diverse experience talking to lots and lots and lots of different types of companies. Most of these companies, security is not their core competency, never has been, probably never will be, but I'll go down swinging trying. One of my first lessons in security happened actually back when I started working for the government, which was summer of 1984. I got an intern position working for a naval research facility. And my job was simply, I was working for a physicist who was doing research and had been doing research for many years in the area of what's called anti-submarine warfare. And he had collected all sorts of research information, articles, books, and put it literally in this filing cabinet, this locked safe. And he had gotten some money and was able to buy one of these newfangled desktop PCs. And I'm pretty sure that's the model that he had bought. And he had bought a database program. I think it was DBase 2, if anybody remembers that. And my job for the summer was simply to go through the filing cabinet and catalog everything that was in there and produce some sort of rudimentary database of everything in its holdings. What I found amazing at one point when I was going through this material, some of the material he had been checked out of the research library at the organization, and the date that it had been checked out and had been sitting in this filing cabinet was before I was born. So there was I was 20, 22 at the time. So there's a lot of information in this thing. So the lesson that I learned about security, and I won't read it to you, you can sort of read it while I'm talking, but basically I committed a security violation and I left the safe unlocked one night. And my boss was nearly apoplectic because it was so anathema for anybody to violate the rules, because they have all sorts of rules and procedures of how you check out at the end of the night, make sure that the safe is locked, make sure everything's put away. And I was sort of a young, careless college kid that didn't think much of it. And quite honestly, my thought was, what's the big deal? I work in a facility that's protected by a wall, barbed wire fences, perimeter protections. To get into the building that I worked, you had to go past a security desk, a security checkpoint. to get into the office that I worked. You had to get through a locked door, you had to know the combination, and they had guards all over the buildings that were constantly walking around checking things. In fact, that's how my incident was discovered, because they would come in the offices in the middle of the night and try all the safes. And if they found it open, they put this pink slip inside and that said, "Come see us in security," and would lock it up, and that was the beginning of the incident. So my first lesson in security, for the context of this discussion, didn't have anything to do with computers. And it didn't really have to do with any kind of a breach or disclosure or loss. I simply didn't follow the rules, and I got into a significant amount of trouble for it. Any of you guys do lockpicking, safe cracking for fun or profit? I thought my boss was apoplectic the first time it happened. The second time it happened, and the lesson I learned was that when you're locking one of these safes, it's not good enough to just kind of do a quick spin of the dial. You have to turn it a couple times to set all the tumblers. So I had closed it, thought it was locked, spun the dial, tried the little handle, thought I was good. Second time it happened, if I thought my boss was apoplectic the first time, I can't begin to describe how mad he was at me the second time. Lesson learned. So, in the context of what I'm trying to get at this morning, I really intend this to be a conversation, or at least get all of us thinking maybe perhaps a little bit differently about this thing that we're doing that we call security. I think we have a problem. This is one of the problems I think we have, but the basic problem that I see, especially since I've been in this business so long, I've seen this for so many times, is all the stuff that we do, all the smart people that are trying to solve security and do all the things that we do, all the effort and all the money that's in the industry and in the business, there's still breaches happening. And I've given up trying to keep this slide current. It's just too hard, because every time I give a talk, there's some variation of this slide that I usually work into my talk. It's just too hard. Just this week, there's in the last week or two, I did try to get it a little bit current. Microsoft Patch Tuesday started breaking things, so they had to kill the patch. It's not exactly a security issue, or is it? This one was really interesting. I think this just came out yesterday. We talked about it. I do a podcast, by the way, called Security Weekly. We were recording last night. We were talking about this. Who knew that something that was designed to be perfectly secure, WPA3, fixing all the problems in WPA and WPA2, and then we discover that it's got problems. And that's kind of the pattern of our whole industry, and that's been the way it's been for many, many years. But then you have something like this. All the technical solutions that we pursue, all the research and all the smart people doing all the technology stuff, and then somebody's doing something with passwords. And believe it or not, and if you've been in the business a while, you might know this, but passwords are still kind of one of the big ways that most bad guys get in. And that's certainly the way that a lot of pen testers do the initial breach, gain the initial access. So somehow we haven't fundamentally solved some of the basic problems, which is what frustrates me and makes me ask, what are we doing here? We have invested so much in technology and trying to solve the problems of security, and there's so many aspects and elements and things to do it. You've got, and I apologize if you can't read the detail of this, search for this diagram. It's out there, it's on Google, the CISO mind map, but basically all the fine print is all the different things that a CISO needs to worry about to secure their organization. There's a lot up there. I've been in this business 37 years. I know what most of that stuff is. I don't claim to be an expert on all of it, maybe some aspects here and there, but I don't know how anybody, any human, using automation or not, can keep up with all this. So something's wrong. So what I want us to try to do for a little bit this morning is maybe think differently about security. When I started at NSA, one of the lessons that I learned when I was going through my training courses is even something like the NSA, the idea of encrypting communications, protecting communications, was problematic throughout at least our country's history. There were people, politicians, people in government that said, why do we need to protect our messages and communications? And there's this quote that I learned early on at NSA, that gentlemen don't read each other's mail. That's just not civilized. Well, we know that doesn't work. The basics of security, I would submit to you, and I'm chuckling a little bit because last night when we were recording our segment, we interviewed a guy that was talking about this new thing called the need to focus on data, and it's all about the data. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's not new. That's how it's been forever. Anybody ever heard of CIA, the 3 aspects of data security? This is not new. Confidentiality, keeping secrets, keeping your sensitive data protected so that people that shouldn't be reading it can't read it. Integrity, making sure that the data is real. And availability, making sure you can get to the data. These are the basic components of data security, and this has nothing to do with technology per se. It has to do with understanding what your data is that's sensitive, that you need to protect, and in what way you need to protect it, and then figuring out with the use of the technology in your organization, which of these things you need to focus on. Did it do its thing? Okay. I just threw that in there because I think it's cool. And I didn't make it, I found it. Anybody know what movie this is from? Sneakers. Sneakers. There's a scene in Sneakers where the 2 main characters, the good guy and the bad guy, they're having a conversation. Does anybody know what they're sitting on? A Craig. Very good. The bad guy, Ben Kingsley, says to the good guy, Robert Redford, there's a war out there, old friend, a world war, and it's not about who's got the most bullets, it's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think, it's all about the information. Do we all agree that that's kind of it? No argument there? 1992 is when this movie came out. And by the way, when I was at NSA, I used to work on the Cray. That's where we did all of our number crunching. And the Cray that I worked on, you can now see in the National Cryptologic Museum. And that makes me feel really old. But if you're ever in the Maryland area, highly recommend going to the National Cryptologic Museum. If you're there, hit me up. If I happen to be around, I'll come give you a guided tour and I'll point all the things that I used to work on that's now in a museum. And that still depresses me.
Where are you going?
Yeah, no sticker for you. Here's my contention, and this is my grumpy, curmudgeon-y, old-timer kind of approach to things, because when I learned InfoSec, it didn't have anything to do with the computers and technology. I really think technology is our problem at the end of the day. You can quote me on that. But that's reinforced, like when I was at NSA starting to get into the, and that too. I need to learn how to, fight back the hecklers in the audience. I haven't learned that skill yet. When I was at NSA in the latter part, when we were starting to do the red teaming and the pen testing, the office that I was in initially was called Fielded Systems Evaluation. So we were looking at the systems that we were designing, trying to make sure that they were as secure in use in implementation as that they had been designed. Because lo and behold, the way NSA very often would break our enemies' communications is we took advantage of the fact that they were misused. A one-time pad is the most secure cryptographic system in the world. It's cryptographically, mathematically unbreakable if you use it correctly. And the operative part of the name, one time, is what makes it unbreakable. So if you have a page of key that you're using to do a message one time, you're good. If you're trying to save paper and conserve resources and use that page for a month or more for multiple messages, you've introduced a vulnerability that can be exploited and it can be read. So there was a lot of reticence at NSA at the time to do anything in terms of migrating over to software. And there was also this belief, and one of my early lessons was that if anything is created by man, it can be broken by man. I've been thinking about it lately, and I think as a society, we sort of checked out in terms of overall data security and privacy when we decided to just put it all online and digitize it. I mean, if we're really honest with ourselves, we've already said we're willing to sacrifice some measure of security and privacy because of the benefit we get of the speed and all the information sharing and everything that goes along with all the cool stuff that technology brings us. You can agree or disagree with me. But what I want to get to and what I want to, sort of the main point of what I'm trying to talk about this morning is one of the things that I learned at NSA was something that was called the risk equation. Let me show it to you. This is the way I learned it. These are words that we all know. These are words that we all use in our daily lives, in our work lives. You go to a trade show, look at all the, I haven't noticed so much out here, but you go to the large vendor areas, very often you'll see variations of these words out here. One of my frustrations is because I go to a lot of shows and conferences and see these words used in print all the time, is it very quickly becomes clear to me that people aren't using the words, at least in the context of the way I learned the words. And that's a nice way of saying they don't know what they're talking about. So very basically, I know there's lots of variations of actual risk equations because people like mathematicians and accountants, they actually try to assign real values. But just at a conceptual level, at a high level, this thing that we call risk is a function of three different things. Let's call them variables: vulnerabilities, threats, and countermeasures. That's the way I learned it. Oop. Wrong button. If you notice, security isn't even mentioned in this risk equation. So hold that thought. The risk parameters at a high level, again, this is the way I learned it. And I'm sharing this with you because it occurred to me at some point, I get sort of irritated when I hear the terms misused, but then it occurs to me people don't know because they haven't been taught. So I'm trying to teach you, not necessarily the right way to think about this, but the way it was learned classically, and we can decide later on if there's something to be learned here, if there's still a takeaway from learning the classic meanings of these terms. So, vulnerabilities are simply, I'll ask people, what is a vulnerability? And people struggle with giving me a definition. Think of it as a weakness, just a weakness. One word, a weakness. Threats, the way I learned them, are people. Threats are the bad guys. Threats are the ones that want to do harm to you. And then countermeasures are the things that you do to try to protect or minimize or reduce the likelihood of success of threats taking advantage of the vulnerabilities to do something bad to you. With me so far? We'll go back into, we'll drill down to this a little bit in the next couple slides. My source, by the way, is what, it's still called the National Information Systems Security InfoSec Glossary. The version that I used came out probably in the 80s. It's been updated over time. I believe it's available on the internet, so search for that. You might be able to find a copy. This is where I'm getting the actual sort of dictionary definitions of these terms to share with you. So the way I learned it, the InfoSec manual, this is the definition of risk, okay? See how the words are in there, but they mean different things, like vulnerability and threat. And I'm avoiding reading it to you because I hate it when people read slides. I assume y'all can read. This is the definition of threat. This, as far as I can remember, and this just might be my mind failing and I should be in the museum, the way I learned threat, as I said, was people. The definition that shows up in the manual these days is more like what I hear people talking about threats these days, which are the bad things that happen to you. The things that we usually call threats in this industry, I call them attacks. It makes more sense to me. Hopefully it'll make more sense to you as we drill down on this. I pulled this slide from a deck that's literally over 20 years old. This is when I first came out into the private sector and was trying to teach companies that had never done security before about security. this is how we would describe threats. And we would talk about threats being essentially people, but there's other things in there, but most of that is people. And then there was also the motivation. I'm open to suggestion, but is there anything missing from this that applies today that isn't up here? Has this changed a whole lot? Or is this pretty much still the way things are? Anyone have a strong opinion one way or the other? Because this is meant, somebody say something.
What's old is new again.
Something, thank you.
It hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed. But you'll hear a lot of conversations from a lot of vendors and and I'm not going to pick on the sales and marketing people, but they've got to find ways of spinning all this and make it sound new. I've seen in the last couple months, this new idea that insider threat is something we need to worry about. Yeah. Anyway, then we get to vulnerability. And again, vulnerability is a weakness, and it's a weakness in systems. And systems are not just the technology. Systems, by definition, are anything that goes in. It's the people, it's the data flows, it's the workflows. Again, hard to keep the slide current, but it's particularly jaw-dropping to me when we find vulnerabilities that have been there for 20 years, and especially in the things that in the hacker communities, things that we value, things that we think, okay, this is good, this is safe, we can use this, it's protected, and then lo and behold, oh, we've been using something that's been vulnerable all this time. And then finally, the last variable of the equation, something that's called countermeasures, the things that are done to, when you can't eliminate all the vulnerabilities and you can't eliminate all the threats, what's left, you countermeasure. You do something to mitigate, you do something to minimize, you do something to offset the vulnerabilities and the threats. And that all wraps up into this thing we call risk. So, my question to you is, what then is security? Hold that thought. Don't listen to me if you don't want to. But let's go back to the risk equation. This one's slightly different. I've added one that I think is more applicable to the commercial world, the private sector that we live in. And essentially, the original risk equation that I showed you, the risk in terms of national security and the DoD, the way I learned it, the risk was all about human life in one way, shape, or form. Protecting our troops, protecting our forces, protecting our diplomatic corps and our citizens traveling abroad, but it all loosely had to do with protecting human life. In the commercial world, I will submit to you that there are only two risks that organizations face, and that's the ability ultimately to earn revenue, to make a living, and the second aspect is the cost of doing business, the cost of doing everything that they do to run the business or to make the business, quote unquote, air quote, secure. So what's missing from this equation then, which is what makes it hard, is that every aspect of it has a price tag on it. And ultimately, the risk that an organization is thinking about is how much do they want to spend versus how much they think they're going to make. That's what it boils down to. But as you look at this risk equation, here's the real question that I want to ask you to think about. If you agree that there's these four components, or three components that produce a product in this equation, think math a little bit, I'm not a mathematician. And if there's this thing called vulnerabilities, and there's this thing called threats, and there's this thing called countermeasures. And for the sake of our discussion, let's say countermeasure is synonymous with security, which we haven't figured out what it is yet. But my question is, think about this whole industry and how so much of what we do revolves around discovering vulnerabilities. The conference here, other conferences, all the products that are out there, all the technologies out there. Probably a good 90% of this industry in some way, shape, or form is focused on vulnerabilities, okay? But if that's a component, a variable in an equation where there's another variable or component that is something that's called security, then what if everything that we're doing in terms of vulnerabilities isn't security at all? What if it's just our job? We're admins. We're supposed to keep boxes secure. We're supposed to update and patch. We're supposed to have secure configurations. We're developers writing code that is supposed to be impervious to attack. What if all that isn't security? I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying this is how my mind works. Think about it. And the second part of that question is, if everything that we do in our industry, in all these hacker conferences and all these vendors, that's focused on vulnerabilities and to some degree threats, because insider threats are a new thing we need to worry about. What else is there? What if all that we think about that's associated with vulnerabilities or threats isn't security? What is security? That's the takeaway, essentially. And that's essentially the slide that talks about what I was just saying. Agree with me, disagree with me. All I'm asking is think about it. What is security if it's not everything we think of in terms of vulnerabilities and everything we think of in terms of threats? What else is it? I think there's an answer, and I think it's something that's worth discussing. And I don't know that it ultimately helps us in the long run, but I think defining and agreeing on our terminology and what things are hopefully is something that is a way to apply sort of the classic thinking of information security, and maybe that will help us to be a more secure society moving forward, because I don't know what else to try, essentially. You guys with me? Somebody laugh or something. Put me in the museum. So, if you're at all intrigued about what I'm saying, would love to talk to you. Please feel free to disagree with me, probe deeply. If I've offended but that's what I do, I'm sorry. But if you want to hear me talk more, if you want to continue the conversation, I mentioned earlier I do a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly. We recorded our 600th episode last night. Thank you. I am known as a Jedi Master. Don't ask me why. It has something to do with communication skills. I'm in a book that was published a couple months ago. If anybody happens to have a copy, I'd be happy to sign it for them. I am a member of an austere group called the Cabal of the Curmudgeons, which is mostly people that have dinner with Gene Spafford once a year at the RSA conference. Raise your hand if you don't know who Gene Spafford is. Okay, I am failing as an educator, and the people my age are failing because there's something to be learned from the history. Gene Spafford was one of the authors of what I considered to be the Bible back at the beginnings of this thing that we call cybersecurity, but back in the day we called it internet security. So he was one of the authors of a book called I'm not going to get the title exactly right, Basic Unix and Internet Security. So big, thick volume, everything to do, because everything was Unix back then. Unix is the operating system that existed before Linux. It was closed source. Linux was open source. Again, it's a history lesson. Anyway, Gene Spafford is one of the authors. He's been in the business probably 50 years, brilliant mind, and we get to hang out with him, and they let me into the group a couple years ago. I'm also on a game called Freaker Life. One of the anachronism cards is me, and this is a fundraiser for Hack for Kids. They happen to be downstairs, and if you're interested, they actually have a couple copies of my card that I've autographed for them, and they're selling them in a silent auction as another form of the fundraiser. So I'm saying downstairs, go upstairs. I'm sorry, we're in the basement. Find the Cypher Village. It's in the room with all the different villages. Find the Hack for Kids table, and feel free to sign up for the silent auction and raise a little bit of money to try to help kids learn all about this thing that we're doing called hacking. That's my contact information if you're interested. And anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
How do you feel about self-driving cars?
Don't really want to ever get in one. My wife has a car that if you put on cruise control, it'll like brake automatically if it gets too close. I hate it because, not that I'm a tailgater or a bad driver or an aggressive male driver or anything, but I hate that it slows down because I'll like be approaching a car to pass it, and I'm like, I was approaching that car and I'm not ever overtaking it. It's because I keep going slower and slower. It also irritates you. It like vibrates if you start straying out of the lane. I figured out how to turn that off. And I don't know what it's monitoring, but occasionally it'll pop up and say, driver needs coffee, driver needs coffee, pull over, take a break. So I'm not a big fan of technology in general. That's my true confession, and self-driving cars being one of them. I was gonna say I'd rather take the bus, but that'll be automated too someday. Yes, sir.
Go back to your active information slide.
Oh, sure. Because we all know who Albert Einstein is. You're welcome. That was an easy one. Yes, way in the back.
How do you feel about most companies replacing security with automated security?
And I didn't do it the first time. The question is, how do I feel about companies replacing security with automated security? Not a big fan of that either. Although I understand that because of the volume of data and traffic that's on networks today, we've sort of created this mess. There's no way to handle it without automation, but my old way of thinking is you still got to have human eyes somewhere along the way. Use the automation to handle the volume of data and cull it down to something that's manageable, but you still need a set of eyes on it. Over the years, the organizations that I've worked with and for, the ones that I have found to be the most secure, back when I did penetration testing, the ones that were more difficult to break into or they detected you more early. Ultimately, every one of those companies that were sort of doing things right or doing things well, they had one person, at least one person, whose attitude was more or less, not on my box, not on my watch. So they kind of took it personally. And what they did ultimately was they knew everything about their box. They knew what was normal. They knew what was normal behavior. They knew what all the different indicators and monitoring results would look like. They knew what the network traffic flow was supposed to look like. And they had a sense, a knack for seeing the anomalies. It wasn't always scientific, but they knew what was normal, and so they were more likely to detect what was abnormal. Automation takes you there to some degree, but I don't know that we're there yet in terms of automation. It goes back to me to the old movie War Games, where if you actually remember the premise of the movie, they were trying to turn the missile defense system that controlled all the nukes in America over to a computer and let the computer decide when to fire the missile or not, because they were concerned that humans wouldn't pull the trigger, because humans would be too illogical and be too emotional and not want to willfully kill millions of people and destroy the world. So they wanted to turn that decision-making over to a machine. And that's the whole AI, machine learning argument and all the fiction. You know, there's dozens of movies and stories out there that sort of ask this whole question of, you know, when the machines take over, you know, are the machines going to protect humans, or are the machines going to think that we're the problem that is creating all the problems in the world, so we must be destroyed?
This is why you always say thank you to Alexa when you reach out.
That's right. It was funny, I was driving around the other day, and whoever the DJ was on the radio station I was listening to, he was talking about his Alexa. His Alexa had said happy birthday to him when he woke up that morning. And he was kind of freaked out that Alexa knew his birthday. He asked one of the other people in the studio, or told him about it, and they went and asked Alexa, hey Alexa, when's my birthday? And Alexa didn't know. What was freaky about the conversation was he was referring to Alexa as if Alexa was a person. In the entire conversation, he's like, wow, it's just amazing what Alexa knows. And like, it was just disturbing on so many. That was cool, it was neat, but also profoundly disturbing, at least to me. Any other questions? I have no idea how we're doing on time.
You have 4 minutes.
Ooh, it's magical. Any other questions? Yes, way in the back.
So you make a distinction about risk and how organizations used to consider it risk equals human lives, right? And now it's about corporations and big money dollar. Now, have you seen in your experience that, say, a business, maybe it does something where it considers human life more valuable? Do they spend more money in security? Do they consider security more valuable at that point? Or is it the organizations that the money loss is so they put more money into security?
So, a very long question, and I'll try to repeat it for posterity. It's okay. In government terms, the risk equation I had said is in terms of human life, the risk to human life, but in commercial terms, it's really money. So the question was, have I ever seen organizations that do sort of take into account human life and care, and do they spend more or less money on that? Is that pretty much it?
Yes.
Cool. I'm old and blind, so I think you were giving me a thumbs up. Now that I've repeated the question, let me actually think about answering the question. So my initial statement, both parts are generalizations. I mean, there's exceptions to everything. There are certainly companies that are more caring about humanitarian efforts and things like that, or they're improving over time. I don't personally use Apple devices. I don't have an iPhone, and I have two reasons. The first of which is I'm sort of a militant left-handed person, and there was some iPhone, I forget which version it was, that came out that didn't work for left-handed people, because left-handed people hold the phone in their right hand, whereas everybody else holds it in their left hand, and apparently however they put the antenna in the phone, it was covered up if you were holding it in your right hand. So I was like, Apple's dead to me, because they don't think about left-handed people. But the other reason, more to your question, is the use of conflict minerals and how conflict minerals are attained. And not to go way off the rails, but conflict minerals are minerals that are basically either acquired through slavery or some sort of illegal activity where humans aren't really regarded too well. And one of the key ingredients of the screens in your phones that make them able to be touched and used as, instead of, in the old days where there used to be buttons, is, I forget what the name of it is, somebody shout it out if they know, but it's a mineral that's a conflict mineral. And there's, I'm sorry? Sapphire, thank you. There's organizations that track, the major phone manufacturers and keep track of sort of their record on how closely they pay attention to where they're getting their materials from, or who's assembling the phones for them, in third world countries. And of course, what do we do in our industry? We do offshore development in many cases because it's cheaper. Not saying it's a human rights abuse or anything, but it's a complex question. It's a complex world we live in, but the motivation at the end of the day very often is money. So thank you very much. I'm around all day, and tomorrow perhaps we'll